Hello and welcome back to the final lecture for our course. In this farewell lecture, we will take a few minutes to highlight some of the common mistakes made with writing history papers and to look at the basics of clean and proper argumentation. As with most things in life, consistency is one of the most important aspects of a successful paper. This involves internal consistency both in your writing as well as in the organization of your paper. Consistency in your writing often comes back to properly formatting your paper. Once again, for this paper, we'll be using the Turabian style for our footnotes and bibliography. It is important that you check your formatting with the Purdue OWL guide that I provided, as many of the auto-citation tools you may find online do not do a proper job. Likewise, even when there are two or more ways to properly approach your formatting, for example using BC AD for dating versus BCE CE, or citing your primary sources with in-text parentheticals versus using footnotes, what matters is that you stay consistent throughout the paper with whichever approach you settle on. Even more important is organizational consistency. One of the central pillars to the organizational structure of the paper is your thesis statement that should be at the start of your paper. More on this later. Since your thesis should serve as a roadmap and a snapshot of the larger paper, it is important that you maintain consistency between your thesis and the rest of the paper. Your reader should never have any doubt where he or she is in the structure of the paper. Given the short length of this paper, there is no need for any sort of lengthy introduction. Either be brief or skip the introduction altogether and go right into your thesis. Any academic paper you write for a history course should always be formal, both in its writing and in its argument. As such, you should avoid informal writing norms including contractions, digitizing numbers less than 100, and using slang, dramatic, or idiomatic language. When referring to academic publications, you should also use correct terminology. So you will be discussing books, works, chapters, or articles written by scholars and historians, not novels, essays, or papers written by experts, authors, or writers. Here are a few more examples of informal writing to avoid. The developers of Civilization 5 didn't take into account the complex logistics that accompany an army in the field. Here, didn't should be written out to did not. Avoid contractions. There have been 3 main releases in the Diablo series. 3 should be written out. The Romans were the best fighting force in the history of the world. The real meat and potatoes of their strength came from their ability to swiftly put their enemies 6 feet under. These sentences are filled with dramatic language and informal idioms that should be scrapped. Finally, when people talk about the ancient world, they generally think of Brad Pitt's flowing locks of hair or Russell Crowe shouting, "Are you not entertained?" This is the sort of introduction that you should avoid. You are writing a formal academic paper, not a blog post. Stick to your argument and to what matters for the paper. Next, these are a few other common mistakes to avoid that many students make on their papers. First, it is easy to generalize about the past and assume that a single group of people represent everyone's views, but this is rarely the case. So, for example, the opinion of Rome and the Romans may or may not be the same as the opinion of all the Italians. Likewise, just because the city of Athens valued certain principles does not necessarily mean that all of Greece thought the same way. People likewise tend to conflate the US government or the actions of a single president or leader with the views of all Americans. The best way to avoid this is to always remain as specific as possible with your language. In a similar light, as a general rule, you should always avoid the use of superlatives in academic papers. And yes, I know that I just used a superlative. When you use words like every, all, never, always, none, and so forth, you're creating an argument in which only one counterexample is needed to undermine your entire argument. If you were to try and think of a superlative statement right now that had no counterexamples, you might find it more difficult than you think. Such absolute truths are hard to come by, and they are nearly impossible when dealing with human actions and the past. Not only does avoiding the superlative greatly strengthen your argument, but it will also draw less criticism. For example, if I say that BioShock is the best video game ever made, most people will disagree and be up in arms since they believe that their own favorite game is better than BioShock. However, if I say that BioShock is one of the best games ever made, most people won't have a major issue with my statement, since it still leaves room for their own personal choices. Another important mistake to avoid is making moral judgments on the past. Your role as a historian is to make arguments based on evidence. Your role is not to be the moral judge, jury, and executioner of past actors and actions. While you can acknowledge actions of violence and historical atrocities, by placing moral judgment into your paper, you generally stray away from the path of objectivity and weaken your argument. Assuming that historians are always correct is another common mistake. Hopefully, given our constant critiquing of multiple scholars and historians throughout the semester, we have a good grasp on this. But it is important to remember that you can and at times should question the objectivity and accuracy of your evidence, both your secondary as well as your primary sources. Finally, be sure to be careful to use proper punctuation throughout the paper. Chapters and articles should be in quotations, while books, video games, and foreign language should be italicized. As we have already hinted at, one of the most detrimental mistakes that most students make when it comes to papers and argumentation is not being specific enough with their details. At no point in your paper should you leave any of the who, what, where, when, or why questions unanswered. For example, if you're looking at Rome Total War's presentation of the historic Battle of Raphia, you should tell your reader when the battle was, who the commanders were, why it was fought, and so forth. This should be done efficiently and effectively, carried out with a well-placed phrase or two. This level of specificity should be reflected by the fact that you've only chosen a few factors to look at from the video game. Moving now to looking at arguments more generally. It is important to understand what argumentation entails from the base level. Every argument is made up of one or more premises followed by a conclusion. The premise is the statement of support for your argument, basically a statement of evidence, while your conclusion is what you're trying to convince your reader of. Together, these parts form an argument. Let's look at a few basic examples. In this first argument, my premise is that The Lord of the Rings: The Return of the King was nominated for 11 Oscars and won all 11 Oscars, including Best Picture. My conclusion is that The Return of the King was critically well received. This is a very basic argument, but again, the premise is standing as support for my conclusion. In other words, I'm saying that you can tell that the movie was well received based on all these awards, my evidence. No matter how simple or complex an argument is, at its foundational level, it is always a question of premises and conclusions. In the second example, I have 3 premises to support my conclusion. Premise 1. Whoever murdered Mr. Body had to have access to the billiard room. Premise 2. Only Professor Plum had access to the billiard room. Premise 3. Professor Plum only had access to the candlestick. My conclusion: therefore, Mr. Body was killed by Professor Plum in the billiard room with the candlestick. This is an example of a strong, valid argument. If all of my premises are true, then the conclusion must likewise be true. A valid argument. If one of my premises is not true, perhaps Professor Plum also had access to the lead pipe, then my argument would still be valid, but it would no longer be sound. These 2 examples of argumentation reflect the 2 main types of arguments that we tend to use, deductive and inductive. Like with our clue example, a deductive argument, if it is valid, must always be true. The conclusion must necessarily follow according to logic. For example, all dogs are nice, Riley is a dog, therefore Riley is nice. Again, assuming the premises are true and that all dogs are nice and that Riley is a dog, the conclusion that Riley is nice must be true 100% of the time. There is no room for a counterexample. Conversely, inductive arguments rely on high probability rather than absolute certainty. For example, most cats are dumb, Stoli is a cat, therefore Stoli is likely dumb. In this inductive argument, based on our premises that most cats are dumb and that Stoli is a cat, assuming these are true, it seems like a pretty good guess then that Stoli is dumb. And maybe, in fact, Stoli is one of those rare smart cats, and our conclusion was incorrect. Even if this is the case, though, our argument was still strong, as we'll be right 9 out of 10 times. It should be fairly obvious that sound deductive arguments are naturally much stronger than inductive ones. As we stated before, however, such deductive arguments, which necessarily rely on absolute statements and the superlative, all dogs are nice, are nearly impossible to come by in a field like history. Thus, for this paper, you will be relying on inductive arguments. There are two main ways in which your arguments can run into problems. First, you might have faulty argumentation due to the fact that one of your premises is incorrect. For example, Skyrim has sold over 100 million copies, GTA 5 has only sold 95 million copies, therefore Skyrim has better graphics than GTA 5. Maybe Skyrim has not sold over 100 million copies. In fact, it has only sold around 30 million copies. This argument would be faulty then because one of the premises is untrue. The second problem comes from a faulty conclusion. This usually stems from faulty logic. In other words, even if your premises are correct, the conclusion may not follow logically. In this example, the two premises do not lead to the conclusion of better graphics. A plus B does not equal C. In order to avoid these faulty arguments, especially when we are dealing with inductive reasoning, it is very important for historical papers to frame what your specific argument will be looking at. In this case, what are the specific limited factors that you will be examining that you believe best determine a game's ability to successfully simulate the historical past? It is these factors that will guide and organize your paper and form the larger premises for your overarching argument. It might be helpful then to think of your paper as having big A arguments as well as little a arguments. In the example that we talked about last lecture, if I were to do a paper on Age of Mythology, my three factors would be the game's presentation of the Trojan War, how well Age of Mythology simulates the constant violence and warfare of the ancient world, and finally, how the random map feature of Age of Mythology can help players to avoid historical determinism and understand historiography as a created narrative. So on the macro level, the argument of my paper corresponds to these three factors. Premise 1, 2, and 3 are my factors 1, 2, and 3. And my conclusion is that Age of Mythology in fact does or does not do a good job simulating the historical past. This is our main argument, premises and conclusion. Yet, in order to make these main premises convincing, however, they themselves need to be supported with evidence. Thus, in this way, each of your factors themselves will serve as conclusions supported by premises. In this web of argumentation, then, you will be making arguments in order to prove your conclusions, which are in fact the factors and premises for your larger conclusion. Namely, whether or not your video game does a good job simulating or representing the historical past. While this may be confusing at first glance, it is important to think about your argument in this structured manner, as the success of your paper will in part depend on your ability to frame and structure your organization in this way. The last piece of this process, and in some ways the most important, is your paper's thesis statement. As we've discussed in previous lectures, your thesis ought to serve as a roadmap and a snapshot for the paper as a whole. In terms of the structure of argumentation, just by reading your thesis statement, I should be able to accurately diagram out the structure of your paper at all three levels of its argument. Thus, your thesis should tell the reader what your final conclusion is, the factors that you will be looking at, and what primary source evidence you are relying on in asserting these factors. And of course, the thesis statement should be clear, strong, and exact in this presentation. The thesis statement is really the pillar of any strong historical paper. As a final example then, again using Age of Mythology, this might be a reasonable thesis statement based on the factors I suggested above. This paper will analyze how well Ensemble's Age of Mythology simulates the experience of the historical past through its representation of the Trojan War, through its depiction of constant violence between city-states, and by allowing players to avoid historical determinism and experience the craft of historiography. By comparing the game to Homer's depiction of the Trojan War, by examining Thucydides' presentation of the customs of ancient Greek warfare, and by understanding history through Hayden White's lens of historiography, this paper ultimately concludes that despite its pedagogical weaknesses, Age mythology offers players an authentic and useful representation of the historical past. We can see in this example that the thesis clearly explains the final conclusion of the paper, the factors that are going to be examined, and the types of evidence that will be used to support each of these factors in turn. Do not underestimate the importance of a well-structured thesis. With that, we will bring this final lecture to a close. I know that you will still be working on your final papers for the next few days, but I want to say that it's truly been a pleasure teaching and exploring these video games with you during these past few weeks. I do hope that the course has been interesting. Best of luck with your future endeavors, especially those of you who are about to graduate. Please don't hesitate to let me know if I can help you in any way. Have a great rest of the summer, and I'm really looking forward to reading all of your papers.